In other words, the character of God is contagious. Do you know that the glory that was on the face of Moses was only an external manifestation of the fact that the character of God had come into the life of Moses as he spent time with God? You say, how is that? Well, notice what we find in Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3. The Bible has something to say very interesting about Moses. Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3. Now the man Moses was very, what? Humble. You know, the King James Version says he was very what? Very meek. More than all men who were on the face of the earth. Now, do you know what the word meek means? Let me give you a definition from the World Book Dictionary. Not easily angered, mild, patient, forbearing, gentle, docile, submissive, courteous, compassionate, humble, merciful. And then finally it gives a definition, the divine grace of self-restraint in the face of malicious criticism. Let me ask you, was Moses all of those things? He most certainly was. But I want to ask you this, was he that way during the first 40 years of his life in Egypt? He was definitely not that. In fact, let's notice what we find in Exodus 2, 11 and 12. Before he spent those 40 years in Midian with the Lord, and before he was with Israel out in the wilderness, he was a violent man. He had a hot temper because he had not spent the time with the Lord. Notice Exodus 2 and verses 11 and 12. Now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Let me ask you, did Moses have a violent temper? He most certainly did. He arose and he killed this Egyptian, which was beating up one of his kin. In other words, one of his, the people that belonged to his nation. You see, Moses in Egypt, being surrounded by the glory and by the power and by the fame of Egypt, had assimilated the ideas and attitudes of Egypt. And the life of Moses can be divided into 3 equal 40-year segments. The first 40 years when he assimilated the culture of Egypt and he reflected Egypt. The second 40 years where he spent with the Lord in Midian, taking care of Jethro's sheep. And there he spent time with God in the mountain, and he became the meekest man on earth. And then 40 years in the wilderness, tending God's spiritual sheep, Israel, where he manifested that experience that he had with God. He manifested God's character in his life. Let me ask you, was Moses patient during those 40 years in the wilderness? You know, one of the most marvelous stories that I find in the whole Bible is the story of Moses. As he led the children of Israel through the desert to the promised land. I mean, these people were whining and complaining all the time. I probably would have lost my temper in the first day. But Moses didn't. For 40 years, whenever Israel complained, he said, okay, well, let me consult with the Lord. Listen, he was even willing to give up his life in order to save Israel, the Bible says, on Mount Sinai.